Welcome to the NAHA webinar, brought to you by the National Association for Holistic Aromatherapy. To learn more about NAHA, please visit www.naha.org. Tonight's presentation topic is A Rose by Another Name, the critical importance of understanding proper essential oil naming. This educational webinar is being presented by Ja Skipper. Ja is a passionate field botanist. He has worked on conservation projects to improve plant understanding in Turkey, France, Morocco, and Colombia. For the last 7 years, he has taught hundreds of herbalists to recognize plants in the wild for the École Lenoise des Plantes Medicinales. Through this experience in growing up on a medicinal plant farm, he has developed an interest in the integration of botanical skills and knowledge within the herbal and aromatherapeutic world. His current work is focused on the limitations and challenges that consumers and professionals face in regards to valid essential oil naming. To learn more about Ja, please visit www.kathysatars.com and www.aromagnosis.com. And I'd like to just take a moment and welcome Ja for being here this evening and presenting on this really important topic that all aromatherapists need to have this information in the beginning of their education throughout and as information is updated. So we really appreciate you spending some time with us this evening tonight.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I'm very excited to be a part of this webinar. And yeah, hopefully it'll go well and welcome on board.
Thank you.
All right. So yeah, the topic was very well introduced. Today we're going to speak about the importance and challenges of essential naming in the context of obviously aromatherapy, home use, or expert use. So I chose this front photo before we really go in depth, very particularly because it's a traditional photo from the south of France, a farmer's scene that could have, been very close to where I lived, and they're distilling in field their harvest of cultivated lavender. And back then already, naming of essential oils was a challenge. And actually, the standards and the way they named essential oils was quite different. They only used the common names, and they also tended to add a qualifier of quality, because obviously the techniques back then and the way it was extracted, we had a lot of different qualities, and according to what application one may use for the oil in question, it was very important to know what quality the oil was, or if it was really blended with another oil. So a lot of, if you look at the old manuscripts, a lot of the oils would be something like lavender, good quality, or second grade, or something like that. But anyway, that was just a little hint at the past. Today, we're still, as consumers, as aromatherapy is exploding and is being taken away from the Middle East, from France, from Europe, and it's been really, really spread around the world even more so. Many more challenges come with this changing industry, and a lot of new people as well are coming into this industry, into this topic. And so the way we name essential oils is a basis. How do we identify the essentials? So that's the start of all the rest, all the good stuff starts here. So I was introduced and very well at that, so I'm not going to dwell on who I am, but the basics is I'm a passionate field botanist, and I've kind of involuntarily dropped into the rabbit hole of essential naming. It kind of fell on my lap, and I found it very interesting because it integrated many aspects of what a botanist has to deal with, because a lot of the naming in essential oils uses botanical namings, but also is divergent and is a budding, not quite yet formed structure. So it's very heterogeneous, very different according to where you're looking. It's not unified yet like botany is. And so that leaves a lot of room for challenges and problems to be resolved. And I thought maybe with my background as a botanist, I could bring my 2 cents and hopefully share some of my realizations, and hopefully bring you along and avoid you making mistakes that I saw were easy to make. So let's get right into it. Why is essential naming or nomenclature so important? Well, just before this, we recorded this webinar, we had a lovely little chat about the link between herbalism and aromatherapy, the plants themselves, and the fact is that I come from a background of teaching herbalists, so people that are actually going to go out in the wild, pick wild plants, and they, in the herbal community, at least the one I know in France, there's in general quite a big consensus that it's very important to understand how plants are named, and then the products of these plants are named, because you can imagine if you go out in the wild and you harvest a medicinal plant in the diversity of this huge planet, right? We have up to 400,000 vascular plants on Earth, they're estimated around. So, if you have to single out one species amongst this huge collection of plants, well, you better do it right, because some of these species might look very similar, but not be so good for you. One plant that could heal, transform you psychologically, physically, could also be its cousin could also be your downfall. So herbalists understand that, because they are confronted to a huge diversity of plants. But perhaps because in aromatherapy, we're dealing with a finished product. I mean, we can transform it further, do blends, do bombs, and etc. But we're dealing with a quite refined product, and it's already been handled by many people, and it comes to us through this human distribution chain, which is not the wild. And so there's maybe this, I don't know, this is my opinion, but there might be this false sense of security that, all right, well, now it's been transformed, now it's part of the human world, I'm less responsible for singling out the differences. Well, and that might be true to some extent. There's way less essential species than there are herbal species. About 3,000 commercially available, of which 300 are really, really common. So it's much smaller, but an argument is that essential oils are very concentrated. You have a very concentrated, potent product. A few drops can do a lot to you. So that's why naming an essential oil, understanding how the essentials are named, being sure of that is really powerful. It will mitigate, to some extent, a big chance of you mistaking two oils that have different properties, different safety profiles for one another. So it'll reduce the danger. It's a first step to reduce the danger. Secondly, to identify an oil for its sustainability, if the oil is actually sustainable or not, well, we have to start by knowing what it is. If a common name is the same for two oils, then it's impossible to know which one we have, and then we might be using an endangered species without knowing it, and that's not great either, right? We want to preserve our internal ecosystem, but not to the detriment of the external ecosystem, right? And thirdly, I think this is a bit of an extra one, but certainly aromatherapy is a bit bashed on by general population in many countries, because there's a lot of new people, there's a lot of different things going on, and so there's some skepticism, and because it's like, and rightfully so in some cases, you wouldn't yield a loaded firearm without knowing what you're doing, and this is a strong analogy, but you wouldn't want to use an essential oil without knowing really what it is, right? So this is a premise. Let's go into a theory of it. So what is nomenclature? Nomenclature is simply the system in which we name things, especially in the branch of science. So, that's just the definition for those who weren't up to speed on it. So plant nomenclature and essential oils. So as consumers, we're going to start off, what I'm going to try to do is, first of all, break down how plants are named, the nomenclature behind it, and then go into the distinctions that essential oils have from the plant naming, and what we need to know and how to apply those distinctions, because it's not a one-to-one, but it's still very useful to understand the plant naming. So here on the photo, you can see there's a rosemary essential. It's written in French, but we still have a Rosmarinus officinalis. And that's something you'll see a lot, and I'm sure a lot of you already know. That's the botanical name, or otherwise the Latin name. It's composed of two parts. And there's also a third part to that name, 1.8 cineol, which is, in this case, the chemotype, or the infra or intraspecific epithets. That's quite a mouthful, but basically it's anything that qualifies an oil after the species name. All right. So those are the things we're going to break down right now. All right. So well, I'm not going to dwell on this one, but so we have a plant on our right, the live plant. Its common name is rosemary. Its family is Lamiaceae. So you have to understand that the way we name species in botany is embedded, like in those Russian dolls that fit in one another. It's got layers, it's got levels, and so you could start with the order is a big level where you would have the Lamiales, would have different families within it, like the Lamiaceae, Robontraceae, so on. And so these families contain themselves a bunch of other things like genuses and species. So it's as you go down in that hierarchy of relatedness, groups are bound together by their similarities and their distinctions. And so it sounds a bit abstract, but basically think of the traditional tree of life drawn by Darwin. That relatedness, how that image of the ape being related to a human. Well, it starts off with a big category, the ape family, and it will go down, and then you have the chimps, and you have other families, and then it'll go down again, and then you have the humans, right? So it works the same with, so the naming system for plants is embedded in a similar system than that, but really what we're interested in are the families, and then the genuses and species. So here, to illustrate my example, we have 3 different species, all right, from 1 to 3. They're 3 distinct species. And they're defined distinct because they have characteristics that are stable enough and morphological genetic characteristics that are stable enough and different enough that we can't say they're the same thing. All right, that's simple. It's quite intuitive. You go outside, you see 2 different rose species. Well, that's quite clear they're different. Sometimes it's not clear, but in this case, it is quite clear. But they belong to the same group, which is called the genus Rosmarinus. So although they're different species, they belong to the same group. And that group all share common characteristics. In the case of rosemary, they all have 2 stamens that are, so the Lamiaceae is characterized by having 4 stamens, but the Rosmarinus, has 2 stamens, right? And has the 2 other stamens are transformed in these sterile little counterweights that will enable these stamens to pivot when the pollinizer goes into the flower. So we have traits which are constant. So we have a common genus, and then above it, just like I was saying, the Russian dolls. Well, those genuses, well, that genus is contained with other genuses that share similar traits for the Lamiaceae, which would be square stems, usually opposite leaves, zygomorphic flowers, 4 achenes, so on. And so that will grant those similarities between the genuses will grant them to be given their own family name, which is the Lamiaceae, a very important family for us herbalists or aromatherapists. So that's basically where a botanical name you'll see on your central bottle fits into the system. It's a bit abstract if you're not used to it, and I do invite you to read more material. There's a bunch of people that are actually working towards trying to demystify botanical names for essential users and herbalists online, and they're doing a great job of it. So if you want a longer take, do go and read some of those articles. So this is just an add-on, I think, if for you to understand what you're seeing on your central label or bottle. If you see an X between what we call the genus, so the Lavandula, and in this case, the species name Intermedia, it means you're dealing with a hybrid species. So it's a species that is, just like the mule will be a hybrid between a horse and a donkey, that plant species has 2 distinct species parents. In this case, Angustifolia and Latifolia. So this is Lavandin, Lavandin in French, I don't know the English name. So just so you know, because it's very important, a lot of people are not aware. And then once you see the botanical name on your bottle, on your product list, or whatever you're working with, or your book you're referring to, you might also come across something after the species name. And if it's not the author's name, then it will be what we called an infraspecific epithet. So it's something that is morphologically or chemically different within that species, but not big enough to grant it to be to create a new species. And those can be very important. I'm not going to dwell on these 3 ones. You should definitely be aware of them. But the most important one I want to speak about, and I've already touched on a bit, is this one, the chemotype. So the chemotype is a major thing to know in essential naming and in aromatherapy in general. It's a very interesting subject. I could talk on a whole hour about it, but I'm going to try to be brief. So basically, a chemotype is, as it's written, is a chemically characterized part of a population of morphologically indistinguishable individuals. So what does that mean? It means that it's within a species, what we just saw, a species, Rosmarinus officinalis. Within this species, you might have stable populations that look totally identical physically, but have a different chemical constituency. And that difference in constituents and concentrations is stable and hereditary. So it's given through the generations. So that's the main kind of definition of what a chemotype is. Now, the interesting thing about chemotypes is that they're very important for naming, and they're often overlooked, and they're also a bit tricky to understand, because a chemotype is named. So here we have an example: Rosmarinus officinalis chemotype Borneo. That chemotype is named differently than, let's say, chemotype 1.8 Senior, which is the most common, simply based, most of the time, simply based on the fact that the first most concentrated aromatic molecule, tested in that population was Borneo and wasn't 1.8 Senior. So we called it, all right, well, that must be chemotype Borneo. And that's great, and that's very useful. It means we can have a way of distinguishing chemically different, with that naming system, we can distinguish chemically different species, right? Or parts of a species. But where is the problem? The problem is because it doesn't mean that you have a slight difference, actually, sometimes it's big, but sometimes it's a slight difference in the first aromatic molecule, the concentration of the first aromatic molecule, that the entire, oh, sorry, I'm getting a pop-up here, that the entire population, am I still connected? All right, sorry about that. I don't know if I'm still connected. I may have had a slight connection problem. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to go back to where I was. It does not mean that you have a chemical difference between the first main constituents, that difference is significant in a whole. You can have the first constituent being different, but on average, the oil is very, very similar. And in fact, it could be argued that some non-chemotype species may have more variance amongst them, amongst the secondary molecules, and thus would be beneficial to identify those differences. Yet, because the first molecule is the same, we don't name necessarily a chemotype. And so that's the shortcoming of chemotypes, you see. And there's no nomenclatural rule for establishing chemotype, however important it is. So more and more people are using analytic methods with scientific or algorithms to use all the panel of aromatic molecules, or at least a bigger set. So that's very interesting, and I'm very eager to see where that goes. So at any rate, so here you go. We have an INFRASPECIFIC epithets for, well, the chemotypes for rosemary, and the importance of knowing the chemotypes is because each of these chemotypes has quite a different use case. So, in nomenclature of essential oils, if we do not give in the intraspecific epithet when it's due, when it's useful, then how can you use your oil in a specific way? That's just, for instance, verbenon is known anyway in France to be better for the liver, for the immune system, for other stuff like that, whereas 1.8 Senior is perhaps more of a respiratory type of chemotype, whereas the camphor is better for joints, muscle aches, everything. So you see, now we can start seeing how nomenclatural detail enables a detailed use of oil. I mean, it's pretty simple, but so really, we're going to jump into now the examples, the challenges. We've seen the theory, we've seen what signifies, what are the different elements of naming you come across as a consumer, as a user of essential oils, as someone interested in essential oils. And now we're going to see real examples of the shortcomings of the way we name these oils, right? So I'm assuming that most of you use essential oils, use the common name first, right? And that's totally understandable. We speak English. We know most of the plant names naturally. We don't have to learn Latin, and it's easy and it's fast. But where are the shortcomings of only using common names? Common names have a really important place, but where's the shortcoming of only using them? If you're one of these people that only uses common names, then you're running, you know, some cases you need to add the botanical name, and this we're going to see why. Here we have 5 very common eucalyptus essential oil species, and yet if we look at some of the most commonly used common names for these species, there's a lot of parallel. Actually, 4 of them hold nearly identically the same common name. So we can imagine that poses a problem. You know, if you're discussing to someone, a client or your family or anyone, the use of an oil, and you're only saying eucalyptus, the level of detail in that nomenclatural system is not big enough to distinguish what species, and that's where the botanical name shines. You know, because I might not have said this already, but botanical names are, in essence, always given to a single plant. So there's only ever one valid botanical name for one living plant, in theory. So that's really its power, right? Because right now we have the Eucalyptus globulus and radiata, which are very common. If you know, one of them, globulus, is a very great plant, but it contains ketones. So it's actually got a way more dangerous profile than radiata for internal use, for children, for all that stuff. Although they have similar properties, you know. And if you're using just the common name, you might run into that confusion. So that's one big problem with common names. The fact that common names are, many common names can be attributed to different plants, and there's no one common name for one oil. You know, you can use hundreds, and that really leads to confusions. But botanical names are not perfect either. Botanical names can be very confusing. And that's why using just botanical names on their own is also problematic, you see, in the essential world, unlike botany. Here we have a great example that I actually saw off a article, I think, on the Tisserand Institute. And it was very interesting, and I took it here. And so here we can see there's one species, so Cinnamon comphora, and then there's 3 chemotypes, right? So usually with a botanical name, we give the chemotypes, so that's fine. We can, with a botanical name, we'll be able to distinguish those 3 chemotypes. But because there's different oils according to what part of the plant we use, look at the linalool chemotype, there's 3 different oils produced, different oils, you know. Well, if we don't associate the botanical name with a common name, at that point, we are not able to have that level of detail to know which oil we're using, all right? So really, in summary, to think about botanical names, and we're going to transition really into the specifics of essential naming, how it diverges from botany. Plant naming on its own is reliable to identify plants, but not necessarily these plant products. So on the right, I have an example. It's a Neroli plant. So anciently it's called Citrus orienticum. I think now it's gone to Citrus limon, although don't quote me on that because the taxonomy is extremely complex in this genus. But nonetheless, we have 3 different oils for that one plant, and the common names do a better job in this case of representing those 3 different oils than the botanical names. All right. So how to tackle that challenge, right? We've seen that if we use just common names, well, we run into the huge chance of confusion in some cases, because the common names are not necessarily essential oil specific, but they might be linked to the plant in some cases and not permit enough detail. And if we only use botanical names, it's the same thing. Although there's only one botanical name for one plant, there might be more products, more than one product for each plant. And so that's a big problem, you know. And so how do we tackle that? Well, there's a very interesting guideline. I recommend anyone that's got an essential business, any professional, even people that are going out on the market to look for essential oils. If you're a bit confused, refer to this slide and this guideline. It's awesome. So it's ISO. I don't know if you know about this, but it's the International Standardization Organism, and they do a great job. Well, they've done, I think, a good job on this particular paper, and so it's a guideline. So it's not a compulsory set of rules, but it's more, as the name says, a guideline for people and professionals who use oils in the way that they should be named to avoid confusions as much as possible. So the main things they want to include is the botanical origin of the plant, the part of the plant used, very, very important, as we just saw in the case of the camphor tree, the plant phenological stages, so that's also very important, just like the neroli. You know, are we using the flower, the leaf, the fruit. That's different phenological stages. But plant processing prior to extraction, fermentation, pre-drying. So that's something I've not really come across, but I'll be interested if any of you have an experience of that importance. And the method of attaining the essential oil. So that's also super important because, as we know, an expression, a steam distillation is not the same thing for the same plant. So they go a bit more in depth. This gets a bit geeky, but they go a bit more in depth. So these are the 8-9 points, right? So if you go out on the market, or even if you have to recommend, and you're a professional aromatherapist, you want to recommend an oil, and you want to make sure that the person you're recommending that oil to doesn't get the wrong oil. They're maybe novice, maybe it's the first time they go out, and the market is unregulated, very unregulated and very diverse, a bit scary for newcomers. Then you can just refer to those 9 points and try to give them those 9 points if they're important. Geographic origin might not be important to you if that oil doesn't change according to the geography, but it's up to you to know which ones you include. But the maximum we include all those 9 points. So I'm going to go through them. Obviously, an essential oil. That's because it seems logical, right? But actually, there are many other aromatic products that can be confused with essentials that have totally different use cases and safety profiles, right? So absolutes, oil resins, concretes, and so on. And so they are, often used. We often use a type of a solvent which is not water, another solvent, and they have different profiles. So it's important for it to be labeled properly. The common name, as we saw, very important. This is why I diverge with them. They say the botanical name if no common names are available. Well, I disagree, because of a point 7. They say in point 7, to distinguish different species with the same common name, use the geographic origin. So what do they mean? If there's a new species, if there's 2 species that have a same common name, as we saw, that's very common. That's actually, it happens a lot. Then all you have to do, according to them, right, is use the geographic origin. All right, well, that works for a lot of species, but for my eucalyptus example, it doesn't work. They come from Australia, and some of these species have overlapping geographic distributions. So although they might have the same common name, the origin will be the same as well. So I guess they would say, well, use a different common name, but how can you ensure and enforce that everyone's using the appropriate common name? Because common names are not really regulated. It's just whatever common name is used most is the one in use. So for me, that's where I disagree, and I think that's where botanical names really come in handy and should definitely be included in your product page, in your books, if you're writing books, or even if you're going to buy essential oils, definitely try to look for the botanical name. Intraspecific epithet, we've already gone through the really important chemotypes, for instance. Plant part use, very, very important. We saw that with the example of the camphor tree. Geographic origin, super important, because you have totally different, in some cases you have chemotypes, geographic types. Well, actually geographics are underneath, but you have certain, and also cultural ways of extracting the oil. The culture that goes around the oil also defines what the oil quality is, not only by quality as in like it's a good oil, but also like the chemical qualities of oil. And so some oils are renowned from one geographic area and being superior than others, or being better for one thing. So that's very important if you have that case to have that origin. Geographic type is great if there's no chemotype, but there's a geographic difference. Definitely have to have it. That's a very underused bit of information. Actually, that's budding. I think there's a lot more work towards this, and the extraction method, obviously. So we're going to go into real examples that I pulled off internet. We're not going to name distributors, but these are just American distributors I just haphazardly came across. No pointing fingers. It's just to have a concrete example of what we come across as consumers if you want to buy an oil, and about the naming. Where does it lie? What problems it might cause us, and how can we solve it? So the first product we're looking at is this cacao vanilla essential blend. All right, and so it's okay, well, they say it's an essential, or they say it's a blend. Well, that's good. At least we know it's a blend. They give us the 2 common names. All right, great. And then I looked everywhere on the website, and the only information I could find about what was in the bottle was this little contains section. And you can see there's cacao, and they have a Latin name, Theobroma cacao, vanilla with the extraction method CO2, vanilla planifolia. Okay, so I'll ask you guys who are listening to this, where do you think the nomenclatural errors lie? You know, what is missing to qualify the oil enough detail for it to be useful in an aromatherapeutic context? You know, so I'll tell you straight away, if you might have found this by yourself or not, but first of all, vanilla and cacao, we cannot physically extract an essential oil from. So in this case, it's written vanilla cacao essential oil blend, but the plants from which the essential oil is obtained cannot produce an essential oil. Right? The temperatures and pressures required are not right for water. Water doesn't do a good job. It doesn't produce aromatics in the traditional ways we distill essential oils. And so that's a big red flag. You know, if you go to a store and you buy water, you would not want it to be alcohol in it. You know, it's just the basics of naming. So that was wrong, but it's not in itself a bad. You know, it's not terrible. But on the bottle we can't show it here, but it was written absolute, and cacao is usually offered as an absolute. So that's interesting. But they didn't say in that section if it is an absolute or not. They just, on the bottle, they said the whole product was an absolute, which is kind of weird to me because vanilla is attracted by CO2, and that would produce a CO2 select or total, which is basically just a vanilla olea resin. So really, there's many problems in the naming because they don't qualify as we just saw on the guidelines. I mean, they don't have to follow the guidelines. They've done nothing wrong. But just on our end as consumers, people interested in using oils as precisely as possible, it does cause a small problem. I mean, it might be a great product. I mean, look, there's 4.7 stars. People love it. It might be a really high quality product, a pure product. That does not mean it's not a good product, right? It just means that right now, with the information that is given to us as consumers, it's kind of hard to have a targeted approach, right? You know, so the product name is wrong, as I said. There's no origin. You know, where does it come from? You know, was it produced? Well, vanilla and cacao is always grown as a crop, but you know, so that's all right. But there's no plant part used. We don't know if it was vanilla flowers or pods, and they don't tell us the extraction method for the cacao. So as I just said, it reduces our chance of being precise, and also it might, kind of lead people to misusing the product in cases where absolutes and olea resins shouldn't be really used, you know, because they're attracted with solvents, and some people are sensitive to solvents, and they have a slightly different use case. So because it's named essential, that might lead to confusion. It doesn't mean that's a bad product, but it just means that as consumers, that's, you know, it's kind of hard to make a good choice here. Second product, so our trusted rosemary is kept along the whole way through this webinar. I like that plant. But anyway, yeah, so here we actually have a bunch of information. Really impressed. You know, I wrote this online course called A Comprehensive Guide to Buying Essential Oils. So I scouted around a lot of the different offers in different countries, and the American offer seems to be you know, the one suffering from some of the misnomers more commonly. And for an American distributor, I think they're offering, you know, very high amount of information. There's no chemical data, you know, like a GCMS or anything. That's not really the topic of today anyway, but still, it's good. They have like a Latin name. All right, cool. That's written in italics. It's written as per the botanical rules, so that's really great. They have origin. The origin is a bit lackluster because, I mean, for rosemary in particular, as we just saw in the guideline, they say geographic origin, and right, so that is a geographic origin, but it's so vague, you know, might as well, you know, at that point, it's like, well, it's from Earth, you know, because rosemary is very different from Morocco, Algeria, France, Spain. They have very different cultures around that plant, and also different plants, right? So it's actually quite important if you're using aromatherapy in a targeted way to know that. So, but still, it's good. At least we know it's in the Mediterranean. It's not that bad. Steam distilled, that's great. Plant used, leaves, flowers, that's awesome. So in this case, it doesn't really matter. It's always that. But in some other plants, you know, we know that according to what plant, it totally changes the oil. And then they say it is an essential oil. It's 100% pure. That's awesome. But can you spot out what's missing? You know, what's the glaring missing information if you want to use oils in a targeted manner here? If you want to reduce your chance of confusing and misuse. Well, the nomenclatural problem in this is the missing chemotype. right? That's the glaring problem. If you, I would advise any distributor or anyone using the Lamiaceae family that are chemotype to be sure to buy, to require that your vendor tells you clearly what chemotype is, because then it's going to cost you a bunch of money to do the analysis, and that you're not going to do it. So you might as well get it from a vendor. Be sure what chemotype is, right? So we haven't got enough detail. We can't use it detailed. You know, as I said, the rosemary chemotypes have quite different use cases, and in some cases, in some plants, as we, you know, it could also be different safety profiles. And actually, I think the 1,8 cineol is slightly less aggressive internally in France, and we tend to use plants, and it's actually, you can use it slightly safer, and for younger kids as well. Although don't quote me on this, but yeah. So third example. So the third example, actually, you know, we're speaking about Cedrus atlantica, so the cedar wood, mythical plant, you know, beautiful plant. And it's a plant that's close to my heart because I worked in the Mediterranean, and particularly the High Atlas in Morocco. And so, you know, that plant is endemic to Morocco and occurs in the High Atlas, the Rift Valley, and also mainly in the Middle Atlas, where it creates these beautiful strands. And the wild populations are actually very important for a bunch of, so they're really what we call an umbrella species in ecology. They facilitate the living of a bunch of other insects, mammals, and plants that are also endemic to that very rare and vulnerable ecosystem. And so, if we look at coming back to the oil, we're buying an oil, right? Well, we're buying an oil from a plant, all right? Well, we have the Latin name, it's given clearly. The common name, that's really good. We know that it's an essential oil, it's given. They give us the region where it's from, so it's from Morocco, and they give us the part of the plant used, all right? And so this is a bit of a tricky one, because we might not, in the guidelines, they don't necessarily tell us this, but this is an add-on that I think is very important to you guys with buying oils and naming oils. In certain cases, it's very important that the oil is qualified, is named with the type of production. And why is that? Well, because you see, we know that this plant is being harvested in Morocco. Well, this plant is on the endangered list of species that are in risk of extinction. So it's a plant that is susceptible to extinction. It's been overused, the habitat's been degraded, and so on. And so, because this oil comes from a native area of a plant without knowing the production origin. By that I mean if it's wild crafted or if it's cultivated, because it's a very wildly and very easy plant to cultivate. You know, it might very well be cultivated. They cultivate it widely in Morocco. I saw big cultivated storms out there. But because they don't tell us, we're incapable of actually, you know, knowing if we're dealing with a wild crafted unsustainable oil or a sustainable one. And so that's where I would add to the guidelines already given by ISO to include in the case of species known to be threatened with extinction, whether it's wild crafted or not. And that should always be part of the product list, in my opinion, the way we name essential oils, right? And when I say essential naming, it's a bit of a wide one, isn't it? Because, you know, you name someone just by one name. Oh, maybe they get a second name. It's like, I'm Jar Skipper, you know. But because we're using it for medicine, because we're using it for heating, and because there's a risk of, you know, there's a real danger associated with these concentrated molecules, we need more qualifiers, and that's a bit boring. We don't need to use them all the time, but we need to use them in the specific cases where we think there might be a confusion. If we're practicing aromatherapist with our clients, if we're a family member with our family, if we are trying to buy oils that we want to use in a very targeted, maybe a more involved way, you know, when you go out on the internet or in the shops, these are things you're going to have to name the oil with. You're going to have to use that nomenclatural framework, you know, so that you're sure that you're not buying unsustainable, not buying the wrong product altogether. So really, you know, for me as a botanist, gone through all this research on essential oil naming and the distinction between plants and oils and the systems in place and the disjunctions and the traps and the problems. Well, you know, these are the things that really came out to me, really stuck out to me. They're not necessarily the final answers, but they're just things I would wished could maybe come along in the essential world for us as consumers, as users, to make it clearer. So I wished, and I really do hope, that the American market may, and actually all markets, adopt the known guidelines from reputable sources as much as possible for the naming. You know, it'd make it so much easier for everyone to have a safer and more targeted use case for our oils. You know, it's the first step. You can't go and look at a book on how to use a chemotype if a chemotype isn't given to you. So it'd be great if those guidelines were applied much more readily. You know, just a side example, in France right now, every essential oil bottle comes with, what I saw anyway, comes with a chemotype, even if it's not a chemotype species. So the main one or two, and now even three molecules that are present in the oil are very often labeled on the bottle or on the box with the oil, and that's amazing to me. And I'm hoping you know, that will kind of trickle down as well. So using chemotypes as a qualifier for every oil, I think that'd be really, really powerful. You know, I also hope there will be an establishment of a structure that's unified and agreed upon for attributing chemotypes in the essential oil market, a bit like Linnaeus did with edifying the rules, or basic rules for the name of plants that has enabled botanists to single out one species from a huge jungle, you know, and quite reliably. Well, it would be amazing if a team of scientists or a team of passionate aromatherapists worked together with chemists and so on, and proposed a model for the community of establishing chemotypes in a unified way. I think that would be maybe one of the keys towards, you know, ensuring that the oil you have is actually really what you think. You know, I think the production origin, so what by that I mean if it's wild crafted or cultivated. I said every essential oil, but really the main thing I wished that was part of all the oils we know come from plants that may be vulnerable of extinction. You know, that should be a pre-requirement. Then you can make your mind up. You know, they can have all the paperwork. You know, oh yeah, they're legal, but you know, then you can make your mind. Oh, actually, this is a wild crafted version of this species. So we know it's impacted the wild population that is already dwindling. I'd rather not, you know, be detrimental to the outside ecology just for my own benefit, you know. But without that information, without that nomenclatural rule, without that naming system, well, we're incapable, without that power. So I think it would be really, really powerful if, for the known species that are vulnerable to extinction, to always include the production origin. That would be awesome. And, you know, obviously include the plant part used, and that's just the basics. So, I mean, it might sound absurd, but this is maybe a name we could give to an essential oil. You know, essential oil of cultivated Indian sweet basil. The Latin name would be optional. Leaf, you know, sweet basil leaf, chemotype linalool. And you can imagine that with that, you can do much, much more than just sweet basil oil. You know, what type of oil is it? You know, is it chemotyped? Where is it from? Is it organic? Is it well crafted? You know, the name would answer all those questions. And I think we don't have to use that type of name in every context, but in contexts where a challenge may occur, where it's critical, that would be awesome to at least go towards something like that. So, you know, we spoke about essential oil naming. We spoke about a tiny part of really what makes us able to use oils, but it's the first part, you know. It's before you can use an oil, as I said, you need to be able to identify it. After you've identified that oil, you can choose what books you refer to, define its properties. You can transform it. You can look at its chemistry. You can look at everything else, all the different quality criteria, all the different methodological things derived should only be allowed if you feel comfortable that you have the right oil. And sometimes we don't know we don't have the right oil because we don't know there's so much variation. We don't know there's so much differences and subtleties. And I really hope that my webinars helped you to feel those subtleties, to feel that, all right, well, maybe we are grasping at something a bit bigger than just the common name. Maybe it'd be good to integrate some other aspects, at least the technical name and plant part. You know, that will ensure that I'm a bit closer to being sure of what oil I have, and I'm hoping that's what it gave you, that understanding, that confidence to say, all right, well, I'll buckle down and I'll just add a few more things to my qualifiers for my oils. That's really what I'm hoping, and it can sound quite boring. It's a methodical, it's a methodology. It's a bit square. It's guidelines, rules, and all those things. Sometimes that can be in contradiction with the subjective aspect of using a great oil. It's like all I want to do is just smell an awesome oil and have a good time. That's why I use oils, and not to be stressed out and having to learn all this scientific lingo and everything. And I don't think you have to, but you certainly have to understand the basic minimum, because just like handling, a firearm, or that you have a danger associated, so you need to know how to use it. Or if you want to play guitar, unless you're one of these very rare geniuses that is able to just wing it and be one of these, amazing guitarists, 99% of us will have to go through a boring phase of learning the basics, a few basics, so that then we are after free to exert the beauty of music, And I think that's the same for essential oils, it's like, or anything really linked to plants. Plants, they're so powerful, they can heal you, but they can bite you back, And essentials are the same thing, they're super powerful, super amazing products, but they can also bite you back. And that is to honor their capacity for change, good or bad, because you never have one without the other, really. It's in honoring that maybe that will give you the energy, if you're not inclined to go towards this more rigid aspect. It's only the start. You only need to learn it once, and then you're good. You have your safety, and so that's really the gist of it. And so just like as my conclusion says, just like the central market, the botanist has to contend with all these plants, and it's crazy. And we follow these rules, and they're hard. But once you follow these rules, you can single out one plant from the whole forest, and that's an extremely powerful thing to do, because you're precise, because you can feed yourself, you can shelter yourself, you know which plant not to touch, you know what plant means what. You can read a book and learn everything about that single plant. But if you're unable to single out that one plant, then the forest is merely this green mass of unknown, and it's very hard to learn, what plants are and what they mean and what they do. And in the essential world, I think it's very much the same. It's recognizing the diversity, recognizing the challenges, and so really, but just the bottom line is, if you have to come away with just one thing from this webinar, don't forget to use the common name, well, I'm sure you're already using, with the botanical name. Now you know what it means, you know what it is, and the plant part used. Those are I think, really the strict minimum that you should be using when, in specific cases. Obviously you can use a common name on its own when you're just casually speaking about an oil, but in these contexts that are very specific, as I already spoke about, those are the three things I think you should definitely include. And so I don't know where my time is at. I'm running a bit early, but so I'm not super involved on social media, but I do have my work, which is an online course and some free writing on arrowmagnosis.com. And you can reach out to me with any question and suggestions, and also corrections to my slides. I am myself prone to errors, and so you're more than welcome to reach out to me at jarskipper.com. And I'm very thankful to have had the opportunity to share this little bit of knowledge, this little bit of passion, and I hope from now on, just like me, you'll realize there's a lot more to just a name with our essentials. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Ja. And we do have a little bit of time left, so I was wondering, for those that are newer to aromatherapy, would you mind sharing just a little bit more to enlighten us on wildcrafting versus cultivated, and how that applies to buying and purchasing essential oils, or for those people that get into their own distillation and such? Would you mind sharing a little bit more of that to enlighten us? That would be great.
Yeah. No, that would be, very much happy to do so. So there's this. So when I was doing my course, you know, as I said, I'm a trained field botanist with a speciality in conservation, plant conservation. And so it was really interesting to me when I was edifying this course about essential oils and naming and production origin. The whole thing came up between wildcrafted, what wildcrafted even meant, and cultivated, you know. And that's a big topic right now. It's a real hot topic because it's linked to conservation, you know. But I realized that the definition of wildcrafted is a bit loose, because a wildcrafted plant is merely just, I mean, unless, so I'll go into a bit more detail, but a wildcrafted plant is merely a plant that is spontaneously grown and then harvested for whatever use, an essential oil, a tea, whatever, tincture, right? And so that's what the basic qualification of a wildcrafted plant, whereas a cultivated plant is quite self-explanatory. Someone planted that plant and then looked after it and reaped rewards, you know. But when we look at wildcrafted plants, well, you see there's a big spectrum of what wildcrafted means. If you go online, there's a bunch of species which you can buy as certified wildcrafted essential oil plants that are unknown in the wild. Like, as in botanists, do not know their primary habitats. The primary habitat of a plant is lost. And so what does that mean? You know, it's like, all right, well, that plant grew along the man-made ecosystems, agricultural, you know, the forest cuttings and stuff, and was, you know, did its own thing willy-nilly without being planted, but was still very much linked to the human activity. It's like that wildcrafted plant. There's 5 or 6 I identified already. One of them, which is Ylang, is just merely following humans, you know. And so, even if it grew on its own, can you qualify it as wildcrafted? You know, that's the first question. And so you have now these certification labels that have stringent guidelines as well. I'm all about the guidelines today, but yeah, stringent rules, and to make sure that what you are buying as wildcrafted is not only just a wild plant, but is also a certain distance away from human activity and follows all these criteria, right? And it's often the same people that give organic certifications away, they also do the wildcrafting certifications. So I would certainly recommend that if you're into buying wildcrafted plants, first of all, as I already said, be very sure to check, and you can use the free handout I gave. I'm very happy to give that free handout away because I think it's very important. Use the tools in that free handout about essential conservation. You'll see there's 2 main databases you can type in and see if your essential species is on endangered list of extinction. If it is, and it is certified wildcrafted or stated wildcrafted, then it's up to you to make your choice. But it means that that plant, that oil, comes from a wildcrafted population of an already vulnerable plant species, right? And so those are the 2 things. Make sure you have a certification. If you want like a high quality oil, you know, that will really help, because as I said, wildcrafted is just a gray mass of nothingness really without it. And secondly, make sure your wildcrafted species is not on one of his lists, or you know, or make your mind up afterwards, but at least check. I would say so. And then going further than that, the wildcrafted genetics that come along the you know, so the distinction. So you had well, let me just go on my thoughts, but the conservation aspects of wildcrafted versus cultivated, you know, we just spoke about. But then in cultivated, you know, what is the same thing? What does that even mean? You know, it's like, I know it's a bit nitpicky and it's all about the details, but right, well, if you have, we were speaking just before this podcast about this whole scandal going on with glyphosate, you know, different chemicals. Well, all the essential oil producing plants don't tend to require much chemical treatment. Some of them do, right? So, all right, well, I'm going to buy a cultivated plant. That's fine, because my plant may be endangered, so that's a great thing. But then, to what degree are you going to use that cultivated version of it? You know, you're going to use it internally on your skin or for your kids, blah, blah, blah. And in which case, according to your use case, would it not be better to make sure it's organic? You know, so those are the main things I would say, just like the little pointers, helpers, just like a little framework for you to kind of wrap your head around that whole topic that's really bubbling up in the aromatherapy world of wildcrafted versus cultivated, and there's so much more to it. You know, just like everything in aromatherapy. You know, we're saying just before this podcast again that it's a never-ending learning curve. So, but you know, just know that that yeah, there's always more detail, and sometimes in some cases it's good to have it. So I think I've rambled enough, but yeah.
Well, that's why we're so glad to have you this evening and for in the future at the NAHA conference, but also future webinars, because you have so much knowledge to share with us that we are so appreciative of. So thank you very much, Ja.
All right, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.